Hi everybody and welcome to another We Are Mission podcast. I am Gerard Groff from Mill Hill, Scotland, and today I am joined by Father Mark Connolly, who is a Mill Hill Missionary, currently based in Glasgow. Father Mark, thanks very much for taking the time to join us. So Father Mark, for people who might not know who you are, tell us a wee bit about yourself, a wee bit about your background and things.
Well, I was born in Partick, the west end of Glasgow. Catholic family. My mother was originally from County Monaghan in Ireland. My father was Glasgow, born and bred, as was his father. But we were brought up in a very Catholic environment. The family was a very traditional Catholic family, I suppose, in many, many ways. We lived very close to St. Peter's Church in Partick, so that was a very big thing in our life. And I don't mean just Sunday Mass. I mean, we used to go to Mass quite often during the week. And attended the various devotions that were going on in the course of the week there. So yeah, it was, I suppose you could describe it as quite a traditional Catholic upbringing in many ways. During October and May, we would pray the Rosary together at night, if we were around, unless there was something else going on. So that's my religious background in Partick. I went to St. Peter's Primary School. And I suppose hobbies and stuff like that I had. We were in the clubs, I remember that. I was in the arts, there was an art club in the school which I used to attend. That was quite interesting as well. And then I went to Holyrood Secondary, which is on the south side, quite far away actually, but it was one of the best Catholic schools at that time in Glasgow, so my mother was keen to get me in there. And it was a huge school. It was, I think, at the time, it was possibly the biggest Catholic school, secondary school in Europe. And it was a bit, because it was so many pupils, it was all, initially the first few years, it felt really quite impersonal, the whole thing. Everything had to be done in groups, and you know, there was no kind of, very difficult to have an individual relationship with any of the teachers or anything like that. That changed in 5th and 6th year, you know, they related to us much more differently as adults, I suppose. And so the last couple of years of Holyrood were great, I enjoyed them. But the first few years were kind of tough because there was a sort of, you were just part of the crowd really, you know, there was something very impersonal about the whole thing. So that's the background I come from in Partick. You're probably wondering how I ended up being a priest. I had an uncle, so this is my mother's brother. His name was Eamon, but we always called him Teddy. And he was a missionary, and he joined the SMA. And while still a young priest, he was sent to Nigeria, and within 6 weeks of arriving, he was dead from yellow fever. This is back in 1936. I never knew him. But all his personal belongings were sent back. His priestly artifacts arrived back, and they were always kept in a special kind of cabinet. And as a child, I remember seeing them and being inspired by his story, how he kind of knew that it was a dangerous place for a missionary to go at that time because there was no vaccinations against yellow fever. So he knew the risks, and yet he still kind of said yes to God. So that was quite inspirational for my own vocation. And for some strange reason, I don't know why, I was very interested in the Philippines, going to the Philippines as a missionary. I must have seen a film or something like that. It kind of fascinated me. But anyway, and so I discovered that the Colombian missionaries work in the Philippines. So I wrote this letter to the vocations director in Ireland, inquiring about how I would go about, you know, joining and being interviewed or whatever was required. And then the paper that you used to work with in the Observer, I saw this advert for the Mill Hill Missionaries, and one of the countries that they mentioned was the Philippines. Because they've got a house up the road from me in in Downhill. So one day I just decided to pop in and see what the lie of the land was, and that was, I still remember that was in my last year at Holyrood, so maybe November of 1971. I knocked on the door of the Mill Hill house in Downhill and asked to speak to the vocations director, and the rest is history, really.
So, Father Mark, when you were younger, okay, you spoke about walking in the door of the Mill Hill Missionaries, but when you were a kid at school, did you ever envisage being anything else?
Not in a serious way. I mean, obviously, when at secondary school, you have to make choices with regard to the courses that you're doing. So for me, I was always interested in modern languages. So the thought of becoming a modern languages teacher one day was in my head at one point. The idea of becoming a priest was there in the back of my mind, but it never really crystallized until the last couple of years of secondary school, really, and actually decided. And the reason I did that was because I thought, if I don't do anything about this, it's going to haunt me for the rest of my life. You know, I'll always wonder whether this was what God wanted me to do. So it was almost like, let me get this out of my system, you know. I might leave after 1 year, but at least I'll be able to look myself in the mirror and say, well, look, you tried it. So that was the kind of mentality I had, even as I was knocking on that door. But I'm going to try this, but I don't really know if it's going to work out. You know, you never have that level of certainty at that stage, I think. And then that was, as I say, in November of 71, and I did my hires in May from Holyrood. And then in September, I went to the Netherlands, to Holland. And that came as a bit of a surprise. I didn't really expect to be doing my studies in Holland. It was an even bigger surprise when I got to the seminary, and the whole first week of the seminary was doing a Dutch army training course, jumping over fences and jumping off walls, and out on a speedboat at one point on the Rhine. And I thought, have I joined the wrong club here? You know, I thought I was training to be a priest, but it was basically a very clever bonding exercise for the new recruits, as it were, in first year. And it worked. By the end of that week, we pretty well knew each other, you know, so it was very effective in that sense. The other thing that surprised me about Holland was they were going through a serious transition in the church. It was much more progressive than the background, my traditional Catholic background, you know, and that was quite challenging, I think, for me. But I could see that, you know, there was a lot of good in it as well. And so my seminary formation was a lot less traditional than, I guess, seminarians here in Scotland or in England were receiving. You know, it was we did a lot of theology, and it was very modern theology. It was all post-Vatican II theology, but it was very good. It was very exciting. It was a very exciting time to be in Holland. It was a very exciting time for the church because all this transition was going on. So I did enjoy the 3 years that I was in the Netherlands. And I think one of the reasons why I joined Mill Hill was they handed me this beautiful brochure of the seminary in Holland, and with a big windmill on the front, and I thought, oh, it'd be great to study abroad, you know, it's so exciting. So that was part of the attraction, you know. God uses different lures to get people to join the ranks, and that was one of them, definitely. So yeah, and then the last 3 years were spent in Mill Hill, London, in our college there. That's in North London. And I remember feeling, oh my gosh, where am I come to, because it was like stepping backwards in a way. It was a very old college. It had been built in the 1870s. And I just left a very modern new building in Roosendaal in Holland. And the staff are still walking around in clerical gear and all that. It was really like taking a step back from the modern kind of Catholic church that we've been exposed to in the Netherlands to a far more traditional, sedate Catholic church. But anyway, you make friends and you get used to the place, and the 3 years passed very quickly. And I think one of the things I should mention about Holland, they built this into the program, the possibility of actually going out to the missions for a few months, just to have a look. And so I went to Cameroon for 3 months. And although it's not enough time for you to really get into the work or learn the language or anything like that, it was hugely educational in terms of actually seeing what missionaries on the ground are up to, and the kind of work that they're engaged in, and the kind of challenges that they face as well as being in Africa for the first time was hugely, in a cultural sense, a real shock to the system.
Did anyone do that and then get scared off?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Several came back. No, in a way, that's the whole point of the thing. It was always done at the end of the Roosendaal, the Dutch part. So this was before we went to Mill Hill in London. The final part was really the opportunity to do this, and it wasn't even mandatory. There was 2 of my class who chose not to go, just so they stayed and carried on with different classes and lectures in the college. But I think they missed out on something because, as I say, from an educational point of view, I learned more about the missions in those 3 months than I could have in the 3 years I was in the Netherlands. And strangely enough, and you're going to be surprised at this, when I left Cameroon, I decided I'm never going to come back here as a missionary. And the reason for that was I felt the church was well established in Cameroon, very well developed. They had catechetical centres, they had parishes, they had outstations attached to the parishes, they had dioceses, they had bishops in place, they were getting lots and lots of local vocations, they had convents with many, many sisters in them. The work seemed to be just expanding and expanding, and I thought, that's not why I wanted to join the Mill Hill Missionaries. I wanted to do what we call primary evangelization, basically introducing people for the very first time to Christ. So I wanted to go to a place where there was no Christian presence, or very little, and begin work from scratch, really. That was my dream, that was my vision of being a missionary. And I got it, because they sent me to Pakistan, to the Koli mission. This is a tribal group of people. They're not Muslims, they have their own religion. But they had none of them were really evangelized properly. There was one or two who eventually became catechists, who had some contact with the church, and they were the ones that we worked through initially, but you were basically starting from scratch. And in primary evangelization, starting from scratch means spending a lot of time just being with people, not talking about Jesus Christ, or not necessarily talking about religion at all. It's just building up a relationship of trust with people. And then trying to present the good news in very practical ways, proclaim the gospel, not so much with words, but by trying to help people raise their social dignity and their human dignity. And with this particular group, there was so much that needed to be done. They were living in these mud villages right on the edge of the tar desert. No electricity, no running water. Practically the whole tribe were illiterate, so nothing as far as education is concerned. So the challenge facing us was enormous. What should we do? What should we concentrate on? So eventually we thought, well, we can do something for the children, for education. So we built 2 hostels in a nearby town, and we eventually persuaded the parents to send their children to that hostel where they could access mainstream education. Later on, I think they built some village schools as well, but this was not during my time. There was nothing we could do about the electricity because that was entirely controlled by the government. So when we went to visit them at night, what we used to do was we would bring along a portable generator and present stories from the Bible and gospel stories through slides, basically. And our catechist, who knew the language, was able to explain to them what the slides were all about and so on, and explain in a very simple way, the main elements of salvation history and the life of Christ as well. For me, that mission was particularly challenging because when I went to Pakistan, the first thing I did was to learn the national language, which is Urdu. So I spent 5 very intensive months in a language school run by the Protestants. And it was very good. We did actually learn the language. But then I was appointed to work with a group of non-Christian people who don't know a word of Urdu. So how do you learn a language that has never been written down? There are no books, there are no grammar books, there's no vocabulary. So you just have to start from scratch, trying to piece this jigsaw puzzle together. So one very hot summer, when we couldn't do much visiting of the villages, I tried to compose, with the help of 2 catechists, some kind of basic grammar in the language of the Koli people. And I think I made about 33, 35 lessons from that. And it was just so that at least when new missionaries would come, I would have something to hand them and say, look, this is what we've done on the language so far. And I produced a kind of, not exactly a dictionary, but I built up quite a bit of vocabulary stuff as well. And that helped me to learn the language as well. So it was a win-win situation. A very tough mission, the Koli mission, because we used to spend most of the week in the villages. So there was no possibility of having a shower. Any water that you drank was coming from the canal. And I got really sick because of that. I got hepatitis from drinking the water. So a lot of health challenges as well, which we shared with the people because they had a lot of health problems as well. That's part of the missionary experience to actually share their life as well at every level. Pakistan's climate and Sindh is the province I worked in. It's very harsh. It's kind of dry heat, but it can go well over 40 degrees regularly in the summer. And even during the winter, during the day, the temperature goes over the 30-degree mark. So it's a harsh environment to work in. It's kind of scrubland, and then suddenly it becomes sand desert as you go into the Great Indian Desert. So it was very challenging from every point of view, really. The diet is very harsh as well. Because they're so poor, they don't have much to offer you. So they're very hospitable people, but they don't have much really to offer you. And whatever they had, they did. So that was kind of tough. But very rewarding in some ways, because we saw, even in the years that I was there, I worked for 9 years with those people. I saw great development in the faith of these people. And an improvement in their general situation as their children became more and more educated and went back to their villages and spread that education, started taking little classes of the smaller children. And so it's a wonderful thing to witness that, how attractive education can be and how transformational it can be.
Father Mark, you spoke earlier on about some of the guys doing the kind of taster mission sessions, if you will, and not coming back. And then you spoke there about some of the difficulties you initially encountered on mission.
Sure.
When you encounter those difficulties or you feel like it's a bit of a struggle, what sort of areas do you draw strength? Where do you draw strength from?
I think your own faith relationship with God, first of all. In my case, I also drew a lot of strength from working with my colleagues who were struggling with the same issues I was struggling with, from the society that I joined. That's one thing I will say about Mill Hill Missionaries, and they do offer you every opportunity in terms of the support that they offer you. It's very, very good. So there's lots of renewal courses, retreats, ongoing formation, I would call it, is there to be accessed if you want it. So I think also, I know this is a strange thing to say, but you do encounter people of great faith when you start working with people, and the faith of the people is something that can be quite inspirational as well. Just ordinary, simple people, and yet they clearly have a deep faith in God and try to live according to that faith. So, I mean, that in itself is inspirational. Every year we used to take a break and go into the mountains just to get out of the heat, basically. And that was very, for me at least, it was a lifesaver because, it was something you looked forward to. Home leave, that occurred more regularly as time went on. Initially when I went out, I think it was 4 years before we could come home and leave. But that lessened down to 3, and I think it's down to 2 now. So that's also that also keeps you going. You're not kind of trapped in a place forever and ever. And I think of my uncle, who was that young missionary, Father Eamon Murphy. When he left Ireland to go to the missions, that was it. There was no facility for coming home. You committed yourself for life to the missions, and so you can imagine what it was like when he was saying goodbye to his family. He was really saying goodbye to the whole part of his life, and taking the risk of embracing a whole new reality. Quite admirable, really. I never had that same experience, obviously, because we were allowed to come home after relatively few years. So big difference. But I do admire, at that time, I admired anyone who was a missionary, because they hardly had the opportunity to come home unless their congregation needed them for some special role or leadership or something like that. I remember talking to a Dutch Franciscan in Pakistan who hadn't been home for about 10 years at one stage. And when he eventually went home, he didn't really know his family anymore. That it was such a break. It was a real challenge for him to sort of reintegrate into his family. I remember him telling me about that. That's quite a sacrifice, really.
Just on that point, then, in terms of the challenging aspects, what kind of qualities or characteristics does a missionary need to have, a missionary priest or a religious sister?
I think if you want to be a missionary, you have to have a very profound respect for the culture that you've moved into. And there have been mistakes in the past where European Western missionaries have gone in and tried to superimpose, if you like, Western ideas, Western culture, and played down perhaps the local culture. So we've learned from that, hopefully. For me, being able to observe what's going on, learning from that, learning how the people do things and why they do it, appreciating the great beauty that's in all cultures, and not being afraid to challenge which is not, things that are not good. That's also part of it too, because remember, we are also Christians, and we have a set of values, gospel values, which are sometimes at odds with the values of any culture that we live in, including the one that we're living in now, by the way. So we shouldn't be afraid to challenge a culture's values in the light of the gospel, but we should not be afraid to appreciate and come to love the tremendous amount of good that's in people's cultures. No matter how exotic those cultures may be, they're so precious and they're so much part of the people's soul that a missionary has to really get into that in order to present the gospel in a way that the people can appreciate themselves and understand. You know?
And just as a follow-on question from that, I guess, what would you say are the most positive aspects of being a missionary, and if there are any negatives, what are some of the negatives?
Well, there's loads of both. How long is your programme? The real positive thing about being a missionary, for me at least, is we get to see the bigger picture of the church. We encounter the universal church in a very, very dynamic way. I mentioned Cameroon earlier. Even at that early stage in my missionary formation, I was able to see that the parish that I stayed in had 24 outstations, and each one of them would be bigger than any parish in Scotland. So that's tremendously encouraging to see the growth of the church, especially nowadays when the church in Scotland is contracting, and we're embracing the reality of having to evangelize or re-evangelize people who are maybe open themselves to the gospel, who may not belong to a particular church or a faith, but they have a spirituality. That's the big challenge for the church in this country. People in this country, if they go to the church, depending on which parish they're in, they often see an age demographic that's not very encouraging, older people, and very few in numbers. Whereas we as missionaries have had the chance to see the growth of a young, vibrant, energetic church taking off in so many countries where we work. And that's hugely life-giving for us. And that's why it's so difficult for missionaries to come home. And again, talking to quite a few Dutch missionaries, where in the 1980s and 19s, the church kind of really bottomed out. For them to go back to that and see the small numbers of practicing Catholics, having come from a very populous Christian environment, that's very, very difficult. So that's one of the big challenges, I think. But it's also a great blessing to have had that experience, you know, and it's an experience I try to share when I do mission appeals. I always try to share that with people, to tell them that there is a whole other reality out there, which is the church. And you must look beyond your immediate environment to get that picture. I think the other, from a satisfying point of view, to see a missionary church becoming a homegrown church is quite rewarding, where you actually are working for your own extinction as a missionary, because you're establishing the local church, you're creating local seminaries so that new priests of the culture of the same country can take over from you, and then you move on to another mission, perhaps. That's very, very rewarding. To see the tools of evangelization developing is also very rewarding. I'll just give you one example. I was saying Mass in a village, a Coley village, and for the very first time, I was able to read the gospel to them in their own language, and to see the reaction on their faces when that happened was that's just a very special moment. Very few missionaries probably get that experience, but I did. The translation into their own language was not done by us. It was done by some very dedicated Protestant missionaries who did a wonderful job working with catechists to translate the Gospels into the Koli language. It's not a language which had ever been written down. Now it is a written language, so there's a win-win situation there, But to see the people's reaction, to see their heads coming up and smiling as they suddenly realise, hey, I understand this. You're not doing it in some other language. Like most of them know Sindhi, which is a provincial language, but it's not their language. It's always like a foreign language that they've worked through. So for them to hear the gospel in their own tongue, it's a Pentecost moment. That's the only way to describe it. And that's a great privilege as a missionary.
Yeah, and that does sound like a really special moment to have been able to witness that and seeing people's reactions in real time and things like that. In terms of other kind of standout memories or stories from your time in the mission, do you have any more that you'd like to share with us?
There's one. It's not. This is this kind of odd thing for me to probably say, but I had a built-in bias against landowners in the area that I was working in Pakistan, because they had a very bad reputation of being oppressive towards their workers who had no land themselves but were just hired farm workers, really. And there was a lot of corruption and a lot of injustice perpetrated on those people. And so in my mind, the landowners had this bad reputation. And then one day I was in a Koli village visiting the people. I'd stayed overnight, and in the morning my car wouldn't start, my Jeep, the Suzuki Jeep in those days. And it just so happened at that moment, one of these young landowners was passing in his big 4x4. And he stopped and he came up and introduced himself and said, "What's the problem?" So I said, "I can't get the car to start." So he immediately called his own mechanic and sent him off to the nearest town to find a spare part. Well, the mechanic had a look at my car first, and then he said, "We need a spare part." So he went to the town, brought that spare part. And while all that was going on, the young landowner, took me home to his villa, very nice villa, and gave me breakfast and introduced me to his whole family. He's a Muslim young man. And then he brought me back, and the mechanic had done the job. The car was fully repaired. And we shook hands, and that was it. Off he went. And I thought, it's sort of like a modern version of the parable of the Good Samaritan, isn't it? The bad guy turns out to be the good guy, And so that really changed my whole kind of thinking, that you mustn't judge it. Whatever you may think about a particular group, you mustn't judge individuals, ever. Jesus never did. There's not one instance in the gospel of Jesus condemning an individual. He had harsh words for groups, like the Pharisees and scribes, but never does he speak against or in condemnation of an individual. And that was a lesson I had to learn. So that's a very real story, and it's stayed with me ever since.
In terms of your own influence on the people that you served and the areas that you served, and also that of the Mill Hill Missionaries in Pakistan, what sort of impact did they make on the lives of the people there? You've spoken a wee bit about education. Was there other areas as well?
There are all sorts of areas. There's, for instance, we were very involved, some of our members were very involved in a thing called the Christian Study Centre up in Rawalpindi in the north, which is basically a meeting place for Christian and Muslim scholars to talk about their various theologies around God and where it comes comes from and learning more from one another. It's had a very long history now. That's been going now for about 50 years, and it's a little light in the darkness, really. It's a real place of hope. So that was helped to established by some of our guys, Mill Hill Missionaries in the north. They worked there. Various social programs as well. Our members were involved in a drug rehabilitation centre in the northwest of the country, in Peshawar. It was started by a Dutch Mill Hill missionary who was fed up burying white foreigners who had come out to Pakistan in search of adventure, and that involved a lot of drug taking, which often caused overdosing because it's sort of an opium growing area, that in Afghanistan, the north part of Pakistan. So he started a drug rehabilitation program. He got help from overseas to do that. And when he died, he handed it on to an American Mill Hill missionary. And when he had to leave through retirement, he handed it on to another Mill Hill missionary. And as far as I know, that program is now being in the hands of Pakistani Christians who are still working there. But it's been hugely effective in saving people's lives. And they treat everyone. Even probably members of the Taliban that have come there for rehabilitation. So they're completely non-discriminatory when it comes to the treatment that they offer. And it's residential. It's a tough apostolate, but it's been instrumental in saving so many lives, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, and you're someone obviously then that's had a real wealth of missionary experience in terms of lots and lots of different things as well. If you were to explain to someone who doesn't know what the term means, how would you explain mission?
Mission. I can only speak for what it is for me. For me, it is hopefully the same as what it was for Jesus, that the Father sent him into the world to reach out to those people who are at risk of believing themselves unloved by God or abandoned by God. And the reason they do that is because there's so much poverty in their life, physical poverty and the hardships that brings, or because they have experienced rejection from their own community in some way, or because they've been sick and they feel that they're being punished by God. So those are the people who are most at risk of believing themselves unloved by God, and these are exactly the people that Jesus targeted. It was a very focused missionary outreach by Jesus, and that's what I have always believed my own mission is. I want to go to those people who are most at risk of believing themselves perhaps unloved by God, and then try to reverse that message by showing them that they are indeed God's beloved sons and daughters. And that to me is the heart of mission. It's a priority in mission. And also the whole thing of introducing people for the first time to the person of Jesus Christ and to his message and to his example. That's a great privilege, to talk about Jesus to someone who is really unfamiliar with the gospel or with the life of Jesus. They may have heard of this person called Jesus Christ, but that's about it. They don't know. To be able to fill in that information for them, and then talk about your own experience, your own faith, and your own experience of being a Christian to other people is a great privilege.
And just when we look at, the fact that the church basically says that we're all missionaries from baptism, but a lot of, lay Catholics won't get to travel to Africa, to Asia, to South America to see the different parts of the church. So they need to be missionaries in their own kind of parishes and areas and countries and things like that. What's the best way for them to do that?
Well, I mean, if you look at most, I don't want to make too much of a generalization here, but many lay Catholics hesitate to share their faith with someone that they know who isn't particularly religious or has no particular affiliation to a church or a Christian institution. There's a built-in kind of reluctance with many of our lay people to kind of lay that on another individual, And I think we should be in the business of training people how to do that, how to do it in a respectful way, a non-intrusive way, that you actually can initiate a conversation in a very simple way with, let's say, a non-practicing person about God, about Jesus Christ. And they will very quickly tell you if they wish that conversation to continue. But to take the risk of making that initial intervention, to me, is a wonderful way of for lay people to reach out to perhaps people who might actually be interested in what you have to say and to hear you talking about your own faith in God. That's one thing. The other thing I think is nothing to do with words. It's by the example of your life. To cause people to ask, well, why is she such a good person? Or why is he such a good man? And then maybe ask them something, well, maybe it's because, he seems to spend a lot of time in church, or he seems to pray a lot, or he seems to have a close relationship with God. That thought might creep into their head, and they put two and two together. So they're giving Christian example, Christian witness in terms of your lifestyle and your values in a society which has, the values, some wonderful values out there in human society, we all know that, but there's a lot of distortion as well, there's a lot of negativity. And to challenge that by our own lifestyle as Christians, is a wonderful way of spreading the gospel. What's it St. Francis said when he was sending out his young missionaries? He said, go out and preach the gospel, and only if absolutely necessary use words. So, there you have it.
Yeah, I love that quote. It's absolutely fantastic. It's one I always go back to because I think example is really, really important. Father, we've got you to define what you think mission is. Now, you're someone that's been at the kind of the sharp end of the vocations issue sort of thing within the Mill Hill Missionaries. How would you define vocation?
How does anyone settle on a particular career? Each person is different, but you listen to your heart, I think. Earlier I mentioned there was something there that I couldn't get out of my system, which I had to attend to. It's as simple as that. Now, you can call that the voice of God, you can call it, this evolution of a real religious missionary vocation. But there was something there that kept coming back, just would not leave me. That's my own experience of that now. And I'm sure it's different for every person, but a vocation, I think, is different from just doing a job or getting a job. It's something that once you embrace it, you say, yes, this is where I want to be. This is what I've always wanted to be. And that happened to me. To give you an example, someone I know who is a teacher, they don't like teaching. So can I say that his teaching career is vocation? Is that vocation? I would struggle. I think when you find some kind of peace of mind and fulfillment in what you are doing that is actually meaningful for you, yeah, well, maybe that's what you have been called to do. That's who you've been called to be. So it's something like that. That's the difference between a vocation and, embracing a career. Something that gives you energy, something that you love talking to people about, as I do, and something you never really want to end. And that's why so many of our guys find it so hard to come back and retire, because what they have been doing all their missionary life has given them life. It's given them energy. It's to embrace all sorts of challenges and hardships even with ease, because of what they were, if you like, getting back from this, the fulfillment it was giving them. And that to me is a great privilege. And it's not a criticism of people who don't have that. I really feel for them. There's lots of people who cannot get what they dreamed for. I did. And that's a great privilege for which I'm eternally grateful. But I would never criticize someone who is doing an ordinary, mundane job, or perhaps a job that's very necessary, but is not something that they find particularly rewarding. I would find definitely be sympathetic towards people like that, because in this world, I suppose very few people actually get to do what they dreamed they would always do. Doesn't stop them dreaming, of course. You should never have stopped dreaming. But, if you get it, I'm one of them.
That's lovely. You've name-checked St. Francis earlier on. Would he be a kind of saint that kind of helped define your vocation? Do you have saints or scripture passages that kind of have influenced your vocation?
The ones that influence my vocation. I mean, I'm a great admirer of Francis of Assisi in terms of his lifestyle, the simplicity of his lifestyle. And I had the privilege of working with Franciscans for many years in Pakistan. But the saints that really inspired me were more at the kind of real dramatic end of missionary life. There was a French missionary called Saint Isaac Jogues, who was a Jesuit and was sent to North America to work among the North American native peoples, which he did for many years. And then he was captured by another Indian tribe who tortured him, cut off his fingers. And he managed to escape, came back to France, and he had to get special permission to say Mass, because in those days you needed your fingers in order to perform all the rituals of the Mass. And the Pope gave him special permission to say Mass, calling him a martyr for Christ. And when he recovered, he went right back to North America and worked with another tribe. And eventually he was martyred there very cruelly. And his love of the people and his desire to introduce them to Christ overcame any fears he may have had of what to expect when he went back. And he and several others who belonged to his group paid the price of that with their lives. Now, that was very inspirational to me when I read it. And I guess the missionary figures among the saints of the church have always been the principal inspiration for me. And some of them were never really canonized. I remember as a child reading a book about an oblate. So these are the oblates of Mary Immaculate OMI congregation, who was an apostle among the Eskimo in the Arctic. And he worked among them for many years, did a lot of good work among them, and he was murdered by someone. He was just murdered. And I thought it very, very admirable to work under such adverse conditions, because you're living and working in the harshest region in the world, trying to bring the gospel to people who are really on the edge of civilization as far as geographically. And that's quite heroic. I suppose at that time as a child, I mean, I always thought of missionaries as heroes, you know, that was definitely part of the attraction, you know. I mean, that gets kicked out of you later on, the hero thing. As you embrace the realities of mission life, the romantic dimension tends to wane somewhat, but the sense that you're doing something that very few people get an opportunity to do never leaves you. That never leaves you.
What about specific scripture passages? Is there anything that you kind of fall back on?
Well, the missionary ones, all the missionary passages that would be inspirational to me. I think a lot of people keep forgetting that Jesus was a missionary. He was sent by the Father. So that text, as the Father sent me, so am I sending you. That's what Jesus said to his disciples. He was very conscious of the fact that he himself had been sent by the Father. And he was now passing on that responsibility, that mission, that vocation to his disciples. That would have been for me. And it has a wider context, because I think it's incumbent upon all Christians to take that on board. How many of our ordinary Catholics think of themselves as being missionaries? It's almost like they think, well, missionary work, that's a kind of, it's an added extra to the Christian vocation. It's not. It is the Christian vocation. It's at the heart of what it means to be, as you said, a baptized member of the church, is you have a responsibility to share your faith with. It's not a private possession. It's meant to be handed on. How you do it, of course, differs from person to person, but the responsibility is universal. The missionary responsibility of the church is absolutely non-negotiable for every Christian.
In terms of the Mill Hill Missionaries, so when you first walked in to, you know, their house way back there in the 70s, how has the kind of makeup of the Mill Hill Missionaries changed? What's the situation for the congregation like throughout the world?
It has contracted. At its highest point, I think it had roughly 1,200 members. This is possibly around the 1930s or 40s. There was 1 year where there was actually almost 40 ordinations in 1 year. So as the church in Europe has contracted, vocations from Europe have also contracted across the board, not just for the missionary life, but for the priesthood and the religious life. So it's been a long time since we had any European vocation. That's the bad news. The good news is we are getting many vocations from Asia and Africa now. And these are young Indians, young Filipinos, young Malaysians, young Congolese, young Kenyans, Cameroonians, who want to share their faith with people who have not had the opportunity to hear anything about Christianity. And they want to join the Mill Hill Missionaries in order to do that. So in some ways our formation program, our training programs have expanded compared to what they were. But the problem is our resources, our physical resources now, our financial resources have also contracted. And so we have to tailor the whole vocations thing to what we can accommodate. So putting that in plain language is we cannot recruit more candidates than we can actually take on board. And that's very hard because it's very hard to say no to people, you know, and to limit a kind of quota of people or candidates that we can accept into our formation programs, let's say in India or in the Democratic Republic of Congo or in Cameroon or Kenya. We have to limit the number of candidates that we can take simply because we no longer have the resources to expand our program beyond its present size.
On that point, one of the things that Missio Scotland and the Pontifical Mission Societies throughout the world do is support seminarians and religious. So that's obviously a very, very important part of our work. But why else would you say it's important for people to support the work of Missio Scotland and the Pontifical Mission Societies throughout the world?
Well, what is Missio Scotland? Missio Scotland is the official Catholic missionary organisation of Scotland. It's a way for every lay Catholic in Scotland to play their part in the missionary outreach of the church. Whenever I do a mission appeal for the Mill Hill Missionaries, I always remind them that they are the first line, the first stage in the missionary journey, because their generosity of prayers and spiritual support that they give us, as well as the material support that they give us and to Missio, without that, and it's a matter of resources, sooner or later, it would have a profound effect on our ability to recruit missionaries, to train them properly, to equip them when they're in the field, and sustain them over a period of time. None of that would be possible without the help that we get from ordinary lay Catholics. And reaching out to organisations like Missio and supporting Missio, that's a wonderful way for them to do that. I also think it's important that they get the opportunity to hear from actual missionaries in the field, and that's where we come into play, I suppose, because not always the staff of Missio have had that opportunity to experience missionary life firsthand. And so down in England, of course, we are in partnership with, the Mill Hill Missionaries are in partnership with Missio England. And so we do most of the mission appeals for that organisation. In Scotland, the relationship is a little bit different. They do separate appeals, as you know. But we're very happy to collaborate at any level with Missio Scotland. In the end up, we're all playing for the same team, aren't we? So yeah, no, Missio Scotland is very important. The great thing about Missio Scotland is it has resources that we don't necessarily have for promoting mission. And it's done very professionally, which is great. And we benefit from that indirectly, I think. As soon as you say you're a Missio, you know, people know what you're talking about. So in that sense, it's complementary to the work that we are doing in Scotland. It's great.
Father Mark, the Mill Hill Missionaries they're obviously the congregation that you chose. To be a bit of a salesman here, what makes the Mill Hill Missionaries special?
I think it's because as a missionary society, it's a society of individuals. Each Mill Hill Missionary is different. We don't have that strong community identity, I think, that you find in some other congregations, where their commitment to the charism of their founder is so strong that in many ways they all live a similar lifestyle wherever you find them, no matter which country you find them. Our guys are so individualistic. They look on our society in a different way. They see it as a vehicle, allowing them to do what they've always felt they're called to do, but to do it in their way. And so when you meet Mill Hill missionaries, you meet people who are totally unalike in many characters. You say, these guys in the same organization. And yet that's our strength in many ways. You know, we are not anchored to a particular charism that would possibly restrict our missionary initiatives as individuals. And that's why we've always been able to be quite innovative in our missionary outreach approach. And for a missionary, that's very important, because adaptation is so important. And the situations that we encounter are so different, and that, you know, we need to be very individualistic in the way we approach things. You know, we can't be so anchored to an institution or a particular vocational charism that we can't really go beyond that, you know. And all the activities that Mill Hill Missionaries have engaged in over the course of the last 150 odd years, it's a huge spectrum. They've worked with drug addicts, they've been teachers, they have been translators, they have been evangelizers, primary evangelizers, they have been catechists. You just go through the list of activities that they've all engaged in. They have been builders, they have been engineers, because we have brothers who specialized in technical areas and have done so much good. So all that's possible because our missionary society is so unencumbered by any kind of a restrictive lifestyle imposed upon us by the particular religious charism that we have. It's very flexible, very open-ended, and that suits us down to the ground.
So, Father Mark, we usually end our interviews by asking our interviewees to tell us something about themselves that people might not know.
Well, I don't think many people knew this, but I had basically, this is as a missionary, I had 3 phobias. One was that I would ever be sent to India, because I found the culture so complex and the religion so complex. I thought that might be too much of a challenge for me. I had a phobia around flying, so I wanted to keep that to a minimum. And I had a phobia around standing up in front of a class and teaching, ever having to teach. And over the course of 12 years in India, I got everything. I got 12 years in India, I got to teach for all of the 12 years that I was there. And I had to fly a lot as well, back and forward, trying to renew my visa. And the miracle, I suppose, is that I came to love all of those activities. And that's why I truly believe God has a sense of humour.
Father Mark, thank you very much for being so generous with your time and sharing your experience. God bless.
Thank you.
Missio Scotland is a Scottish branch of the Pontifical Mission Societies, the Pope's official charity for overseas mission. To learn more about the work of Missio Scotland, you can visit our website www.missioscotland.com. You can like us on Facebook, www.facebook.com/Missio Scotland. You can also follow us on Twitter, Missio_Scotland, and on Instagram, Missio Scotland. If you would like to donate to Missio Scotland, visit www.missioscotland.com/donate. You can also call us on 01236 449 774 or send donations to Missio Scotland, 4 Laird Street, Coatbridge, ML5 3LJ. Please keep us in your prayers. Thank you and God bless.